Hello, hello, hello. My name is John Sierra, and I am a Tolkien scholar. And what that means is that I've spent many years, decades in fact, studying the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. And that also means that I'm generally speaking the kind of guy that you can come to with any question about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. And since, throughout my life, people have asked me many questions. They'll say, hey, John, you know a lot about this stuff, and they'll ask me. And since I actually love getting questions like that because it allows me to indulge in my primary hyperfixation, that's why we started this. I started answering questions on Quora, and now we have this YouTube channel, so here we are. If you want to ask me a question, you can ask me any question that you like right there in the comments. I'm usually very good at answering them in a rather quick manner, although sometimes I get a little behind. I'm a little behind right now, and right after this I'm actually going to try to catch up on that, or perhaps tomorrow, but probably today. Anyway, yeah. If you want to be featured in a video, though, you want to go to a website called, as I mentioned, Quora. Quora is a knowledge-sharing website. It's a platform where you can ask any sort of question and have people with relevant either experience or expertise or knowledge answer your question. And if you go on there and you ask any sort of question about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, whether it's The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings or The Silmarillion or any of its satellite stories or anything else that you can imagine, you're going to get a list of names that you can tag. Now, anybody can answer any question, but these people will directly be sent your question. And if you do that, you will see that my name will be either at or near the top of the list. And of course, you could also go right into the description of this video or any one of my videos. And there is a link directly to my Quora account on there, as well as my Quora space, the Grey Havens, which you can follow to read all of my answers, as well as many others that other people have written about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. That being said, I'm going to ask to like, comment, and subscribe. If you get through the whole video, I think you have to subscribe. I think it's mandated by the law of the Valar, right? That's somewhere in like the history of Middle-earth. Now, obviously, I'm joking there, but these videos are generally about an hour long, and if you get through the whole thing, then obviously I think that you're probably invested, and you should probably subscribe. We hit 2,200 subscribers, or actually a little above that. I don't have the the exact number directly in front of me. Last week I had a terrible migraine, so it was pretty rough going through the video. And what's interesting is that as I was editing the video, I was looking at, like I would just pause here and there to add, images and such. And I just wow, I just could see the pain in my eyes. I just looked terrible. And that migraine eventually subsided, and then kind of came back and then subsided. So I'm doing pretty good here, so we're going to do okay. Anyway, I wanted to read a bit of from Unfinished Tales here, and specifically a bit of a story that in here is one of my favorites. It's called Of Tuor and His Coming to Gondolin. And I've read from it before, what I want to do is sort of read the end part where Tolkien leaves it off, where Tuor reaches Gondolin and goes through the gates, and then the story stops. And what's interesting is that it is basically a very fleshed out and detailed version of the fall of Gondolin that he never finished. And if you get the book that is simply entitled The Fall of Gondolin, you basically get every version of it, or all the important versions of it that Tolkien ever wrote, including early versions and what's in the Silmarillion and some alternate versions, and of course this one, which in that book is called The Last Version. And I think that, although The Children of Húrin is my favorite Tolkien book, I would say that Of Tuor and His Coming to Gondolin, also known as the final version of The Fall of Gondolin, which is unfinished, which is why it's in Unfinished Tales, has some of his very best writing. So that being said, I'm going to read you sort of like the last bit where Tuor has reached Gondolin, and he's going to go through all these different gates to get to the actual city. Thus they went up on the steep way, sometimes by long stairs, sometimes by winding slopes, under the daunting shadow of the cliff, until some half-league from the wooden gate Tuor saw that the way was barred by a great wall built across the ravine from side to side. with stout towers of stone at either hand. In the wall was a great archway above the road, but it seemed that masons had blocked it with a single mighty stone. As they drew near, its dark and polished face gleamed in the light of a white lamp that hung above the midst of the arch. "Here stands the second gate, the gate of stone," said Elendil, and going up to it he thrust lightly upon it. It turned upon an unseen pivot until its edge was toward them, and the way was open upon either side, and they passed through to a court, where stood many armed guards clad in grey. No word was spoken, but Elendil led his charges to a chamber beneath a northern tower, and there food and wine was brought to them, and they were permitted to rest awhile. "Scant may the fare seem," said Elendil to Tuor, "but if your claim be proved, hereafter it shall be richly amended." "It is enough," said Tuor. Faint were the heart that needed bitter healing. And indeed such refreshment did he find in the drink and food of the Noldor, that soon he was eager to go on. After a little space they came to a wall yet higher and stronger than before, and in it was set the third gate, the gate of bronze, a great two-fold door hung with shields and plates of bronze, wherein were wrought many figures and strange signs. Upon the wall, above its lintel, were 3 square towers, roofed and clad with copper, that by some device of smithcraft were ever bright and gleamed as fire in the rays of the red lamps ranged like torches along the wall. Again silently they passed the gate, and saw in the court beyond yet greater company of guards in mail that glowed like dull fire, and the blades of their axes were red. Of the kindred of the Sindar of Nevrast, for the most part, were those that held this gate. Now they came to the most toilsome road, for in the midst of the Orfalch the slope was at its steepest, and as they climbed, Tuor saw the mightiest of the walls looming dark above him. Thus at last they drew near the fourth gate, the gate of writhen iron. High and black was the wall, and lit with no lamps. 4 towers of iron stood upon it, and between the 2 inner towers was set an image of a great eagle wrought in iron, even the likeness of King Thorondor himself, as he would alight upon a mountain from the high airs. But as Tuor stood before the gate, it seemed to his wonder that he was looking through boughs and stems of imperishable trees into a pale glade of the moon, for a light came through the traceries of the gate, which were wrought and hammered into the shapes of trees with writhing roots and woven branches laden with leaves and flowers. And as he passed through, he saw how this could be, for the wall was of great thickness, and there was not 1 grille but 3 in line, so set that to one who approached the middle of the way each formed part of the device, but the light beyond was the light of day. For they had climbed now to a great height above the low lands where they began, and beyond the iron gate the road ran almost level. Moreover, they had passed the crown and heart of the Ecorioth, and the mountain towers now fell swiftly down the inner hills, and the ravine opened wider, and its sides became less sheer. Its long shoulders were mantled with white snow, and the light of the sky, snow-mirrored, came white as moonlight through a glimmering mist that filled the air. Now they passed through the lines of the iron guards that stood behind the gate. Black were their mantles and their mail and long shields, and their faces were masked with visors, bearing each an eagle's beak. Then Elendil went before them, and they followed him into the pale light, and Tuor saw beside the way a sward of grass, where like stars bloomed the white flowers of Uilus, the evermine that knows no season and withers not. And thus in wonder and lightening of heart he was brought to the gate of silver. The wall of the 5th gate was built on white marble, and was low and broad, and its parapet was a trellis of silver between 5 great globes of marble, and there stood many archers robed in white. The gate was in shape as 3 parts of a circle, and wrought of silver and pearl of Nevrast in likeness of the moon. But above the gate, upon the midmost globe, stood an image of the white tree Telperion, wrought of silver and malachite, with flowers made of great pearls of Valar. And beyond the gate, in a wide court paved with marble, green and white, stood archers in silver mail and white-crested helms, 100 upon either hand. Then Elendil led Tuor and Voronwa through the silent ranks, and they entered upon a long white road that ran straight towards the 6th gate. And as they went, the grass sward became wider, and among the white stars of Oilos there opened many small flowers like eyes of gold. So they came to the Golden Gate, the last of the ancient gates of Turgon that were wrought before the Nenaerth. And it was much like the Gate of Silver, save that the wall was built of yellow marble, and the globes and parapets were of red gold, and there were 6 globes, and in the midst upon a golden pyramid was set an image of Laurelin, the tree of the sun, with flowers wrought of topaz and long clusters upon chains of gold. And the gate itself was adorned with discs of gold, many rayed, in likenesses of the sun, set amidst devices of garnet and topaz and yellow diamonds. In the court beyond were arrayed 300 archers with long bows, and their mail was gilded. And tall golden plumes rose from their helmets, and their great round shields were red as flame. Now sunlight fell upon the further road, for the walls of the hills were low on either side and green, but for the snows upon their tops, and Elendil hastened forward, for the way was short to the 7th gate, named the Great, the Gate of Steel that Maeglin wrought after the return from the Nerneath, across the wide entrance of the Orfalch Ekur. No wall stood there, but on either hand were 2 round towers of great height, many windowed, tapering in 7 stories to a turret of bright steel. And between the towers there stood a mighty fence of steel that rusted not, but glittered cold and white. 7 great pillars of steel there were, tall with the height and girth of strong young trees, but ending with a bitter spike that rose to the sharpness of a needle. And between the pillars were 7 crossbars of steel, and in each space 7 times 7 rods of steel upright, with heads like the broad blades of spears. But in the center, above the midmost pillar and the greatest, was raised a mighty image of the King Helm of Turgon, the crown of the hidden kingdom, set about with diamonds. No gate or door could Tur see in his mighty hedge of steel, but as he drew near through the spaces between its bars, there came, as it seemed to him, a dazzling light, and he shaded his eyes and stood still in dread and wonder. But Elendil went forward, and no gate opened to his touch, but he struck upon a bar, and the fence rang like a harp of many strings, giving forth clear notes in harmony that ran from tower to tower. Straightway there issued riders from the towers, but before those of the north tower came, one upon a white horse, and he dismounted and strode towards them. And high and noble as was Elendil, greater and more lordly was Ecthelion, lord of the fountains, at that time warden of the great gate. All in silver was he clad, and upon his shining helm there was a spike of steel pointed with a diamond. And as his esquire took his shield, it shimmered as if it were bedewed with drops of rain, and there were indeed 1,000 studs of crystal. Elendil saluted him and said, "Here have I brought Voronwe Aranwian, returning from Valar, and here is the stranger that he has led hither, who demands to see the king." Then Ecthelion turned to Tur, but he drew his cloak about him and stood silent, facing him. And it seemed to Voronwe that a mist mantled Tur, and his stature was increased, so that the peak of his high hood overtopped the helm of the elf lord, as it were the crest of a grey sea-wave riding to the land. But Ecthelion bent his bright glance upon Tur, and after a silence he spoke gravely, saying, "You have come to the last gate. Know then that no stranger who passes it shall ever go out again save by the door of death. Speak not ill-boding. If the messenger of the Lord of Waters go by that door, then all those who dwell here will follow him, Lord of the Fountains. Hinder not the messenger of the Lord of Waters." Then Voronwe and all those who stood near looked again in wonder at Tur, marvelling at his words and voice. And to Voronwe it seemed as if he heard a great voice, but as of one who called from afar off. But to Tur it seemed that he listened to himself speaking, as if another spoke with his mouth. For a while Ecthelion stood silent, looking at Tur, and slowly awe filled his face, as if the grey shadow of Tur's cloak he saw visions from far away. Then he bowed, and went to the fence, and laid hands upon it, and gates opened inward on either side of the pillar of the crown. Then Tur passed through, and coming to a high sward that looked out over the valley beyond, he beheld a vision of Gondolin amid the white snow. And so entranced was he that for long he could look at nothing else, for he saw before him the last of the vision of his desire out of dreams of longing. Thus he stood and spoke no word. Silent upon either hand stood a host of the army of Gondolin. All of the 7 kinds of the 7 gates there were represented, but their captains and chieftains were upon horses white and grey. Then even as they gazed on Tur in wonder, his cloak fell down, and he stood there before them in the mighty livery of Mevrist. And many were there who had seen Turgon himself set those things upon the wall behind the high seat of Inyamar. Then Ecthelion said at last, "Now no further proof is needed, and even the name he claims as son of Hur matters less than this clear truth, that he comes from Ulmo himself." So that is actually how the story ends, with Tur just arriving in Gondolin and going through the 7 gates. And you'll notice that the number 7 pops up quite a lot there, and this does play into one of the questions that we're going to answer a bit later. As a matter of fact, it is the one from the thumbnail. 7. It comes up again and again, and especially in this story, 7 gates, 7 houses, and of course Ecthelion, he's Lord of the Fountain. That's one of the 7 houses of Gondolin. You might know some others. Glorfindel, he was one of the heads of the houses there as well. But what's interesting is specifically the number 7 and how much significance it has with elves, with men, and with dwarves. And even hobbits to a certain extent. One thing that you see in there is 7 swans. 7 swans lead him to where he gets that mail that Turgon himself had put there, waiting for Ulmo's messenger. And of course, Ulmo sends a mortal man, which is something that they did not expect. And of course, this mortal man becomes the only person born a mortal man with no elvish ancestry whatsoever that becomes immortal, and has sailed to the west and gone to live in the Undying Lands and is counted among the Eldar. And I know that some of you may say, well, that's just something that the elves said. That's their legend. In songs they speak of it. But, Tolkien himself said that it did happen in one of his letters. Letter 131, a font of amazing knowledge, and one that he never actually sent. He wrote the letter to, I believe it was Peter Hastings, and never actually sent it. And it's probably the letter out of all of his letters that I come back to the most for knowledge, because there's so much there. And the reason that Tolkien never sent it was because he said he felt it was a little too self-important, which I don't necessarily agree with. But I think also Tolkien felt that he might have given away too much information as well, and was sort of coming up with an excuse as to why he didn't send it to Peter Hastings, because he revealed a lot, such as that Tur did in fact make it to the West and was given a unique exception by Ilúvatar himself to be counted as an elf rather than as a man, and he's sort of the opposite of Luthien, who became mortal, the only elf to be born with no mortal ancestry. As a matter of fact, her mother was one of the Ainur, and her father was an elf, and so she's like fully immortal, and then to become mortal. And of course, you get others that like Arwen, but Arwen was never really an elf in the strictest sense. She was what they call a perithal, which is half-elf, meaning that she had mortal ancestry and she had immortal ancestry, and she made, a choice because of her ancestry, not specifically that she had men and elves in her family, but because of Eärendil and Elwing in her family, that she had that choice to become mortal. And her brothers had the same choice, and her father and her uncle had the same choice. And some of them, like her father and her uncle, we know what happened. Her brothers, we have no idea what happened. It's always like an interesting sort of point of debate and discussion. But anyway, 7, really important. There's the Valakirka, which is a constellation of 7 stars that has so many different names. Some of them are just laid out in The Lord of the Rings when Frodo was staying, I believe, at Bree. It's mentioned. It's called the Sickle of the Valar. It's called the Wain. It's called the Bear. It's called Durin's Crown. It's also called the Big Dipper. And it's 7 stars, and the 7 stars also represents Númenor. Their flag had 7 stars on it. The standard, which is just a very, very large flag that Arwen made for Aragorn, that he brought to the Battle of Pelennor Fields, and it struck fear into the hearts of Sauron's armies, had 7 stars on it. Also had the White Tree of Gondor. on it as well. It wasn't just 7 stars, but 7 stars represented, in that instance, Westerness, not the West with a capital W, but Westerness, Númenor, Calabeth, Atalanta, all the different names that it had. And we're going to talk a little bit about that and sort of like some of the linguistic aspects a bit later, because you guys know that sometimes when somebody asks me a question, I have to say, okay, well, let's talk about what some of these words mean, because that's the way that I prefer to approach things, because I think that, Tolkien as a linguist and a philologist, words were extremely important to him, languages were extremely important to him, and you can understand his intentions if you understand, the Elvish words that he uses a lot. And if you look at the meanings of them, when you can find the meanings at least, you can get hints as to his thoughts in certain things. Anyway, we have, I believe, 10 questions to get through, and some of them are quite beefy, so we're going to start with your first question. Here we go. Our first question comes in from Danny Linder, and it's pretty interesting because it does have to do with the fall of Gondolin, and I mentioned that there were many different versions of it, so we're going to be talking a little bit about that. When Glorfindel was fighting the Balrog, he was protecting the sick that could not fight. Do elves really get sick, or did Tolkien mean that they were wounded and tired from escape? Now, this is a really good question. Now, some people out there might be wondering, just what are you even talking about? This isn't something that's mentioned in the Silmarillion, which is, the primary source of the story of the fall of Gondolin. So let's get into it. Of course, there's no reference to the sick in the Silmarillion, that specific account of the fall of Gondolin. It mentions many that were wounded, along with women and children. Elves do not get sick, as mentioned by whoever it was that proclaimed the doom of Mandos to the Noldor. It might have even been Namo Mandos himself. Eru had decreed, and Eru, of course, is God with a capital G, and he had decreed that elves shall not fall sick, nor shall they die, though they can be slain, or their bodies can die from waste of grief. They never pass from the world. They don't have an afterlife. They just sort of linger in the world as spirits. They're drawn to Mandos. They may eventually get their bodies back if Namo decides that they should. The quotation used in the question here is from actually a much older version of the Fall of Gondolin, which is found in the Book of Lost Tales Part 2. The phrase is used twice, the latter of which mentions the women and the sick, while Glorfindel is facing off against the Balrog. Now, from the fact that this reference was changed in the Silmarillion to many that were wounded, it might suggest that he did mean wounded when he said sick. However, that's not actually the case, because the former inclusion of the phrase states that the least weary of the women cared for the sick and the wounded. So there is a distinction there between sick and wounded. So what's the deal, right? This can be explained two ways. One is the in-universe explanation, which explains how, different texts that are circulated in Middle-earth give differing accounts of many things, including whether or not elves can be sick. The other is the out-of-universe explanation, which explains why Tolkien, as a writer, wrote two differing things that contradict each other. So the second one, the out-of-universe explanation, I think that's a little easier. It's quicker to explain, so we'll go with that first. The out-of-universe explanation is that the Fall of Gondolin is one of Tolkien's oldest tales. It was written long before The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. It was never published, though, until after his death. He first started writing the story in 1916 when he spent time in the hospital during his service in the Great War. He had contracted trench fever, and when he was recuperating in the hospital, he started in on his very earliest fantasy stories, primitive versions of the Fall of Gondolin and the Children of Húrin, followed by earliest bits of Beren and Lúthien. Consider that the Silmarillion was published after his death. He died in 1973, so we're jumping from 1916, when he's a very young man, serving in World War I, to 1973, when he dies. And then, of course, after that, the Silmarillion is published. And it's not like he wrote The Fall of Gondolin and then he just had it sit in a vault for, you know, his son to find and publish after he died. It didn't work that way. He constantly worked on it. He tinkered with it. He altered it. He rewrote it. And sometimes he would just scrap the story and start over again. The version of The Fall of Gondolin in the Book of Lost Tales Part 2 is one of the very earliest versions. And if you're interested, as I mentioned earlier, in perusing all of the versions, or at least all of the most important ones, get the book that's just simply titled The Fall of Gondolin, which compiles them all into one volume. The version in the Silmarillion is not the last version. That was unfinished. As I mentioned earlier, I read you a bit of it. It's in Unfinished Tales under the title of Turin is Coming to Gondolin, and it has some of Tolkien's best writing. And it's, of course, the most complete version, though, what's in the Silmarillion. When Tolkien first conceived the story, elves were not fully immortal. They lived essentially forever, but they could get sick, and if they died, they didn't return. Later on, he decided that elves would be fully immortal and they couldn't get sick, and if they died, they could return. This was due to his desire to use Glorfindel in The Lord of the Rings, and he had already written of the elf's death in The Fall of Gondolin, and he did sort of consider, well, what if it's just a different Glorfindel? There was also a character in The Lord of the Rings called Galdor, who's an elf that died in The Fall of Gondolin. He decided that Galdor was a different guy, but Glorfindel, he wanted to be the same guy. He wanted to have that connection to the First Age. So he came up with the idea that death is sort of just a brief timeout for the elves, and that Glorfindel was sent back to Middle-earth on a mission from Manwë. So in that version of the tale, there are absolutely sick elves, but it's an early draft. The in-universe explanation hinges on the fact that we must accept that all of the texts that contain tales of Middle-earth exist within Tolkien's fictional and mythological world. We see this in The Lord of the Rings. The previous tale, The Hobbit, is explained as being a book that Bilbo Baggins wrote that detailed his adventure, though with a lot of fluff and flair. Not every event in it happened exactly as written, and one chapter was a lie, although later revised. Just like, you know, in real life, the first edition of the book had a very different version of Gollum, and then they changed it. You know, Tolkien rewrote that chapter, and he tweaked a few things in some of the other chapters, and that's the revised edition that we're most familiar with. And, you know, Bilbo told the truth to Frodo and to Gandalf as well, and then later he recounts the true version of the events at the Council of Elrond. That Bilbo lied at all was chalked up to the influence of the One Ring, though other parts were chalked up to fanciful storytelling. Bilbo was sometimes oblivious to certain things, or he wanted to portray characters like Thorin as being kinder than he actually was. Bilbo's story was finished, and it was given to Frodo, who, along with his friends, wrote their story, The Lord of the Rings, and they put it all into a big book bound in red leather called the Red Book of Westmarch. Also included, once the pages were given to Sam, was something called Translations of Elvish Lore, which were the tales of the First and Second Ages that Bilbo had translated during his retirement in Rivendell. The tale goes that this book was added to by others, such as Faramir's grandson, and it was studied by lore masters such as Findagle of Gondor, and many copies of it were made. Eventually, one found its way to the Undying Lands, and it was later brought back to Middle-earth, which was now called Europe, by someone named Elfwine, who gave it to a man named John Ronald Rhyl Tolkien to translate. You see where that goes from there, right? But what of the other tales? The older versions of tales that have things like sick elves, or Tuor slaying 5 Balrogs, or even one version of Beren Luthien that doesn't have Sauron, but rather an evil cat named Tevildo. Those older versions of Tolkien stories also existed within the fictional framework in which Tolkien is merely the translator. Consider real history and how certain figures come off differently depending on who tells the tale. For example, Vlad II Dracula. In Western European stories, he comes off as a complete monster. He was a tyrannical maniac, but in the more local Eastern European tales, he's sort of a folk hero, and they liked him. Considering that when we turn histories into stories, they get embellished, they get expanded, things are added, things are subtracted, and we get a bit of the flair of each storyteller, and we see these figures through the lens of whoever it is that's telling the story. these early drafts are seen in-universe as sort of corrupted tales of mannish design. The elves wrote their versions down, and they sat in the libraries until Bilbo, goes and translates them into common speech. But he wasn't the first to tell these stories in the common speech. Men did in Númenor and in Gondor, and they did what men do. They passed down the stories from generation to generation, because compared to the elves, they don't live very long at all. And each generation would add or subtract or embellish or diminish and so on. Tolkien even toyed with the idea that the elvish account, the Silmarillion, was not even necessarily true itself. It was just the story the way the elves wished to tell it, an idea that was posited in the book Morgoth's Ring. This would mean the Silmarillion itself is not, canon, but as I've pointed out many times, canon, it's sort of a dubious idea at best when it comes to Tolkien's Legendaria. I hope that clears that up a bit for you. Let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Danny Linder, who asks, which elf tribe lived closest to the two trees, and did that make them mightier? The Falmari were likely the elves that lived the closest to the actual trees in Valinor, and no, it didn't make them mightier. I wouldn't say. There are, of course, many different clans of elves, and it should be understood that these are not racial divides, but simply cultural divides. All elves can basically be put into four categories: the Vanyar, Noldor, Teleri, and the Avari. Now, out of these four, the ones that disperse themselves into the most separate cultures was the Teleri, which birthed the Sindar, the Falmari, the Nandor, and then the Nandor themselves split into the Sylvan and the Lyquendi elves. The Falmari, and that literally means wave folk, translated as sea elves, were the Teleri elves that reached the Undying Lands. And while the Noldor and the Vanyar elves lived in, Eldamar, and the Vanyar lived in, plains around Valinor as well, the Falmari wished to be close to the two trees as well as be close to the Valar, and thus they lived on the shores of Valinor within sight of the two trees. Remember that in the Silmarillion, after the trees were destroyed, the wailing of the Falmari could be heard. The trees don't make the elves mightier, though seeing them does seem to add something additional to their spirit. This doesn't translate to physical might. All of the elves during that period saw the trees, and thus they had the same spiritual boost. The Falmari living near them did not necessarily, give them any additional might. The Silmarillion actually suggests that the might of an elf is due mostly to the circumstances of that elf's birth, and both the history of Middle-earth and the nature of Middle-earth additionally support that a spiritual force is created by the parents that is passed on to their children, somewhat diminishing the parents. Fëanor, for example, he was created to be the greatest of the Eldar in might, as well as in many other ways, in beauty, in craftsmanship, in subtlety, in understanding. He was born of Finwë, that was his father, and Miriel was his mother. And Miriel stated that the energy of 4 children was put into Fëanor, thus explaining her intense fatigue that led to her abandoning her body and reposing in Mandos for a very long time. It is also both suggested and outright stated that at times the elves can become mighty through the blessing of the Ainur. One example of that being, outright stated was Glorfindel, sent back to Middle-earth in the Second Age, and he was given, in the way that Tolkien put it, was additional angelic power by Manwë. An example of it being suggested was that Fingolfin, who was so mighty in his wrath that he fought toe-to-toe with Morgoth, had eyes that shone like the Valar, and those that beheld him in this state thought that he was Oroma. Fingolfin was not always like that. He wasn't just that powerful all the time and that fearsome, and people didn't generally think he was one of the Valar. It was just in that instance when he rode out to battle with Morgoth. So, in that final ride and the subsequent battle, he can be seen as possibly having been empowered by the Valar. And of course, physical might must be backed by skill, as even if the Falmari were mightier because of the trees, which they weren't, they were still slaughtered by the Noldor, who had weapons of war, and they had good armor, while the Falmari only had light armor, and they had weapons for, just hunting. So, there you have it. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question actually also comes in from Danny Linder. Danny just went on Quora and sort of went ham with really interesting questions. And I don't answer every single question that I come across. Sometimes it's like, oh, I've written about that very recently, or somebody else wrote an answer that's, said everything that I would say, or sometimes I'm just not interested in that specific subject. But here are 3 in a row from Danny Linder, who I guess just went ham on Quora. How can it take 27 years to cross a few hundred miles of ice? Is of course referring to the host of Fingolfin walking across the Helcaraxë. So the trek across the Helcaraxë could be compared to man's earliest attempts at polar expeditions, which lasted months or even years. Tolkien even had the idea that it may have actually taken 144 years for the elves to cross the Helcaraxë. It seems odd to think that it would take 27 years or 144 years to cross the Helcaraxë, but consider a few things here. The first thing that we're going to consider is the Helcaraxë was an unknown frontier. They didn't have maps, they didn't have compasses, not that compasses would have worked, the earth was flat, but they didn't have navigational tools, they didn't have charts of the seas. The only thing, the only beings that we know that all went across the Helcaraxë were Valar, like Aulë and Melkor, and of course Ungoliant. It's possible that Melian walked back across it after the death of Thingol. But I want you to think in your mind of man's attempts to reach the North Pole, and that took decades. And of course this included, very many failed expeditions and abandoned expeditions. The second thing that we want to consider here is the Helcaraxë is the most inhospitable region in the world. It would be easier and it would be healthier to walk across Mordor than it would be to walk across the Helcaraxë. This was seen as the final terror that the host of Fingolfin had to face, and they did not all make it across. Also consider that they were woefully unprepared to cross the ice, as they expected to cross the Belagir at its narrowest point by ships. But Fëanor didn't send the ships back, he burned them. They were already past the turn back now or never point of their journey, as outlined in the Doom of Mandos, so they had to face the horror of the Helcaraxë, which they absolutely did not set out to do. They didn't leave their homes thinking that they were going to walk across the Helcaraxë. The next thing to consider is they weren't traveling in a straight line. They couldn't have possibly just walked across it in a straight line. We might think that Morgoth and Ungoliant, they probably went in a straight line, but not the elves. The shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, but it's not always the easiest route. In this case, Tolkien mentioned that they spent quite some time wandering. It wasn't a straight shot. Adding to this is the fact that they were a very large host. We're not talking about, just a few people. We're talking about a large population, and large populations do not move quickly. There were women and children with them. It wasn't a military march. It was an entire population of elves migrating, and it doesn't happen swiftly. And then, of course, we got to talk about the language aspect of it. As I said, my favorite part of answering questions is, well, let me tell you what the word means. The name Helcaraxë itself and the descriptions of the region, it gives us our final answer. Helcaraxë is a Quenya Elvish word, and it's not glossed in the text. The Silmarillion doesn't tell us what Helcaraxë means. But The Lost Road and Other Writings is a book that tells us that it is derived from Helcaraxë. The first element, Kelek, means ice, it becomes hell. And the second, Caraxë, is jagged spikes. So this region is described in the Silmarillion as the grinding ice. So, as I mentioned earlier, it was, very hostile terrain. It wasn't a flat sheet of ice and snow like you might imagine. It's not like a tundra or like walking across like a place like Siberia or Antarctica or anything like that, but it was a constantly shifting terror of spiky ice. The fact that the Helcaraxë was grinding and constantly shifting means that they likely sometimes had to wait for a path to open or even go backwards at times. Waiting for opportunities for the large host to pass safely probably took up the bulk of the journey. Aside from the grinding ice, it was also mentioned to be extremely foggy, and that limited their visibility. And as I mentioned, it's not like they had, navigational tools or maps of the area or anything like that. So a lot of times they probably got turned around and were going in the wrong direction as well. So there's that. I hope I helped you understand it. I mean, 144 years seems extreme to me, but 27 years, yeah, I could see it. Sun years, I can see it in this case. And you have to also remember, I don't love to tap the sign that says it's fantasy, but it literally is a fantasy story. So there's that as well. Okay, let's move on to the next question. So here's a question that came in from the Oski Boski, who asks, what if Melkor made orcs as independent life as Aulë did with the dwarves? Would they be far more evil then? He couldn't have, and Aulë didn't do that, actually. Melkor could create life as any of the Valar could create life, plants and animals and such. He could also create evil beings that were mockeries of true life through necromancy. Sauron did that as well. Dragons, orcs, and trolls, that was all Melkor. And they're all thinking, speaking beings, as are Sauron's creations, the werewolves and the vampires. But they lacked an important component, the ability to choose between good and evil, which is why there were never any good orcs or any good trolls or any good dragons. They were speaking facsimiles of true life, and some of them were even ensouled, though by necromancy, which is an aberration of creation that the Valar would not partake in. Aulë did not create the dwarves with true life. He created them as homunculi, essentially man-shaped puppets. They only did his will, and if his will was focused elsewhere, they were idle. When he was reprimanded by Ilúvatar, God literally comes down and says, "Why did you do this? And what were your motives for doing such a thing?" And he stated that he was, just impatient to fill the world with life. I almost said the void. That was Melkor. And that God had created him to be a creator himself. That was in his heart. And he was indulging his desires to create. He recognized that he had overstepped his bounds, and he offered to destroy his creations, turning on them with a hammer. And then something unexpected happened. They cringed and wailed. They cowered from his hammer. He obviously didn't will them to do this. Destroying something that he created was already a very difficult thing for Aulë to consider doing emotionally, so why would he wish for them to beg and cry? And Ilúvatar spoke thusly: "Thy offer I accepted, even as it was made. Dost thou not see that these things have now a life of their own, and speak with their own voices? Else they would not have flinched from thy blow, nor from any command of thy will." So Aulë thanks God, and he agrees to have the dwarves slumber until such a time that they should awaken, as to not disturb the order of the world that Ilúvatar had in his mind. He did make 6 additional dwarves, because he'd only at this point made 7, and they were all male, the fathers of the dwarves. He made 6 mothers of the dwarves, and he scattered them in the earth to awaken when Ilúvatar bid them to awaken. The gift of life was given to them by Ilúvatar, not by Aulë, which is why that they're sometimes referred to, by Tolkien fans as the adopted children of Ilúvatar. Okay, let's move on to the next question. This question comes in from Jason Moore, and I really like this question. How did the Valar increase the lifespans of the Númenoreans? So the Valar have the ability to alter lifespans. They don't do so to the children of Ilúvatar as a rule, not out of a lack of ability. The Valar are the greatest of the Ainur. It's the angels in the earth. And they are also, by strictest definition, demiurges, which is why sometimes the term Valar, which is Quenya Elvish, and it means powers, but it's sometimes Englished as gods, with a lowercase g. They're not gods in the strictest sense, but they did have a part in the creation of the universe and a hidden part of each of their thoughts, as well as the hidden thoughts of every other angel, including the ones that didn't enter the world. And all of the thoughts of Melkor were put into creation by God, who's called Ilúvatar, or Eru. Thus, they can have a shocking amount of control over the lives and the bodies of living beings, if they so will it. We are told that Manwë, the king of earth, can instantly wither a dead body to allow the Eldar who were slain to return, because they cannot have two bodies in the world. This is even used punitively at times, such as with Fëanor and Saruman. They were denied from having any bodies at all. Part of the charm of the Undying Lands is that everything's immortal there, including the plants and the animals, and they have the ability to grant immortality, but they're forbidden to do this in the case of the children of Ilúvatar. This doesn't mean they have an inability to change lifespans, but rather they cannot affect doom. The firstborn, the elves, must endure in Arda, that's the world, until the end. While the secondborn, the men, and their derivations, the giants and the hobbits, pass from the world on a path known only to Namamandos and to a destination known only by Ilúvatar. The power of doom is sometimes also given to Manwë, as we see in the curious case of the Perithal, the half-elves, Eärendil and Elwing, and thus their scions. Both Eärendil and Elwing chose to be elves, and thus they must stay in the world until its conclusion, and this choice was visited upon their twin sons Elrond and Elros. More on him in a bit. The men of Númenor are called the Dunedain, which literally means man of the West, and they're descended from the noble Edain, which just means man. The singular form of both of these would be Dunedain, such as Bilbo referred to Aragorn, and Adan. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Tolkien's word for man is so similar to Adam. These noble men were a large part of the forces of good that defeated Morgoth, and they were very deserving of a great reward, because they were putting their very lives on the line. While the elves and the Maiar could see bodily death as, something that is a brief inconvenience. It's probably painful and possibly embarrassing, but it's just an inconvenience. Their bravery, though, of the men, facing fear of the unknown and the fear of death that Morgoth himself had instilled on them, was to be commended and thus rewarded, and this is what they asked for. I'm going to read you a paragraph from the book, The Nature of Middle-earth. Long life and peace were the two things that the Edain asked for when the Valar offered them reward at the fall of Thangorodrim. Peace was readily granted, long life not so readily, and only after Manwë had consulted Eru. So, this paragraph, which is from The Nature of Middle-earth, it tells us a lot. The Edain basically asked to live long and prosper, and the Valar were very happy to give them prosper, but they weren't so sure about the live long thing. They certainly had the ability to give them longer lifespans, but they weren't so sure about whether or not they had the authority to do so, and so Manwë did what Manwë does. He preyed on it. It was decreed that the Dunedain as a whole would get lifespans about equal to 5 times that of ordinary Edain, ranging from 350 to 420 years, though Tolkien notes that at 400 years old, weariness sets in, and many of the Dunedain would choose to give up their lives at that point. Elros was sort of a unique exception. He lived to 500 years old before giving up his life, but that can be seen as a consequence of his state as Perithal, a half-elf. He had elves like Turgon on one side of his family and elves like Luthien on the other, along with some angelic ancestry from Luthien's mother Melian. The exact method of increasing the lifespan of these men is detailed as such by Tolkien. The increase of the Númenorian lifespan was brought about by assimilating their life node to that of the Eldar up to a limited point. They were, however, expressly warned that they had not become Eldar, but remained mortal men, and had been granted only an extension of the period of their vigor of mind and body. Thus it seems that through the power of the Valar, the method of increasing their lifespan was essentially infusing them with a little bit of what you might call elf DNA, but noting to them that this doesn't make them elves, they're not immortal, they're just long-lived. Their lifespans were expanded by giving them longer youth. As all divine gifts, it became diminished by a fall. As the Númenoreans lost faith in the Valar, they had poorer relations with the elves, their lifespans started to dwindle. And that opened them up to the voice of Sauron, telling them that turning to worship of Melkor would fix this issue, which of course only made it worse. The widening gap is seen especially in the story in Unfinished Tales, The Mariner's Wife, in which Tar Aldarian's wife ages faster than he does because he's, of Elros's line and she's not. All of the Edain that were given this land of gift had increased lifespans, and they were essentially infused with elvish blood, but Elros was actually part elf himself. Tolkien links aging to falls many times, even in The Lord of the Rings. Denethor is sort of a youngish man of 89 years old. He's only slightly older than Aragorn, who is, in his prime. Now, Aragorn is of the line of Elros, while Denethor is not. But Denethor's son Faramir, who lived his full natural life, lived to be 120 years old. So Denethor, well, he's older than Aragorn in life years, should still essentially be middle-aged, but he appears very old. In Unfinished Tales, it is established that the onset of old age came about when he was 60, not long after becoming steward. And it's believed to be due to his usage of the Palantir, the object that led to him to eventually losing his mind. The death of his young wife assuredly did not help him any. Lifespans and aging are a very fascinating field of study in Tolkien's works, and I highly recommend that if you're interested, you get the book The Nature of Middle-earth, because there's a wealth of information there about this sort of thing if you're interested in learning more. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question, and this is a big one, and this came in from a friend of mine named Laurel Callahan. I was having a discussion with Laurel after one of my live streams of reading The Fellowship of the Ring, and I talked about some stuff in there, and she said, that's very interesting, you should write an article about it and put it in a video. And I said, oh, nobody's asked me the question, but if you'd like to, you could sort of just feed me the question, and she did that, so here we are. So here's the question from Laurel. Is there any symbolism in Narsil being remade and renamed by Aragorn? There's heaps of symbolism here. Some is intended by the author, and a lot of it is intended specifically by Aragorn. One may argue that Aragorn's sword is as much of an important character as he is, and we see its importance when his nature is first revealed to Frodo. I'm going to read you a bit of Gandalf's letter to Frodo. P.P.S. Make sure that it is the real Strider. There are many strange men on the roads. His true name is Aragorn. All that is gold does not glitter. Not all those who wander are lost. The old that is strong does not wither. Deep roots are not reached by the frost. From the ashes a fire shall be woken. A light from the shadow shall spring. Renewed shall the blade that was broken. The crownless again shall be king. So this poem, which is later revealed to have been written by Bilbo Baggins about his good friend Aragorn, Gandalf includes it in his letter in his second postscript, warning that he may meet many strange men and hinting at the fact that some may call themselves Strider but are not the real Strider. He gives Strider's real name, which is Aragorn, and this poem, which tells us some important things about the character. The part that is most often discussed is the first part. All that is gold does not glitter, telling us that Aragorn is gold in the sense that he is valuable and he is precious, but he doesn't glitter. He doesn't appear at first glance to be the king of men that he actually is. Frodo picks up on this very well. He's saying that, Strider is fairer and fouler than an enemy who may go at great lengths to appear fair, but may seem foul, while Strider is this, haggard tramp, but seems fair. Aragorn, to his credit, takes the critique of his appearance in good humor, and he later proves that he cleans up well. Frodo asks an important question after this: do all the verses apply to Aragorn? He admits that he cannot make heads or tails of them, but latches on hard to the first line, which is enough proof for him, along with his own intuition. Aragorn says he doesn't know, but he states that he is Aragorn, and that those verses go along with his name. This is important. He doesn't know if he will fulfill all of the verses, but knows they are about him. Sam is still worried, and Aragorn points out to him that if he wished to harm them, he could have done so already. They've already given him ample opportunity to do this, and with a sudden movement, he goes to draw his sword, but he only puts his hand on the hilt. And a bit later, though, he does draw his sword, and he says, "Not much use, is it, Sam?" So Aragorn admits that his sword, in his current state, is not very much used as a weapon, but states that the time is soon that it shall be reforged, because it's broken into two pieces. And it is reforged in Rivendell, where he gives it the name Anduril, which he states means Flame of the West, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. We are at the Council of Elrond, given an account by Elrond of Sauron's defeat at the end of the Second Age, which included the breaking of Elendil's sword Narsil. Elendil, along with Gil-galad, defeated Sauron, but they also died, with Gil-galad suffering greatly from the burns inflicted by Sauron's hands. And while it's not mentioned exactly how Elendil died, we are told that as he fell, his sword broke beneath him. Later on, during the Two Towers, Aragorn gives us the origin of Narsil, forged in the deeps of time by a dwarf named Telchar. This sword has a long history, but it's mostly known as the Sword of Elendil, and it is broken in two, as is Elendil's realm. Elendil was the High King of a great kingdom, while his sons were lesser kings of two regions. Isildur was the king in the north, which was known as Arnor, which is derived from Arandora, or North Kingdom, while Anarion, his brother, was the king in the south, Gondor, which is derived from Hjalonda, which means South Harbor. Though the names, Gondor and Arnor were not used immediately, the earliest linguistic versions of them were also, they were used in Quenya and in Sindarin, but they were two countries, but they were united under Elendil. So Elendil's sword breaks in two, and his kingdom breaks in two. Arnor and Gondor become separate and estranged from each other. Isildur, as his only surviving son, because Anarion had been killed previously by an object thrown from Barad-dûr, that's the Dark Tower, he took up the mantle of High King, putting Anarion's son on the throne of Gondor and traveling to the north with his sons to establish the kingdom in the north. Now, it is likely that Isildur would intend that he would put one of his sons on the throne of Arnor and reign over both as High King, but he died. He didn't make it to Arnor, and the death of Isildur and the death of all of the sons that traveled with him, so that never happened. Isildur's only surviving son, who is already in Rivendell, he became the first king of Arnor, and with no High King to unite the two, they became independent nations. They were separate now. Elendil's realm sundered as his sword was. The sword came into the care of Elrond. Eventually, both of the lines of kings failed, with the last king of Gondor riding off to war and not returning, and leaving no viable heirs, while Arnor wound up being split into three realms to avoid a succession crisis, and two of them sort of petered out pretty early, with only Arthedain limping along until the last king of Arthedain died childless. Arnor became kingless and mostly depopulated, while Gondor diminished and was ruled by the stewards. The crown of Gondor sat in the halls of the dead, and the scepter of Arnor fell into Elrond's hands, and to be returned to the king if he ever returned. When Aragorn turned 20 years old, he was told his true name. He had previously been called Estel, and he was given the sword. He was told that if he was ever to become king and reunite the two lands, he can marry Arwen, and he will be given the scepter. We know that Aragorn succeeds. Elrond brings the scepter to the wedding, and we have a full return of the king. But we see the beginning of this with the reforging of the sword once Aragorn gets Frodo and his friends safely to Rivendell, as he knows the time is coming soon to become the king and to reunite the kingdom, so too he knows that the sword must be repaired, and he gives it the name Anduril. Now we got to talk about names. The sword's previous name, Narsil. The Lord of the Rings doesn't tell us what that means, but in the 17th issue of a language journal called Parma Eldalambran, we are told that it translates as red and white flame, with the newts nar, meaning fire, and thil, meaning white light. Aragorn tells us right out what his meaning of Anduril is, flame of the west, which shows that Aragorn, he doesn't only speak Quenya, he understands the poetry of naming things in this language. Anduril is derived from the roots Adunia, which means west, and Ril, meaning brilliance. Note that Elendil is not descended from Pharazôn, the last king of Númenor, but of a divergent royal line descended from the first king, Elros, and that his title was the Lord of Adunia when he was in Númenor. He's not referring to the west as a general direction, nor is he referring to west with a capital W as in the Undying Lands, but rather westerness. Númenor that was, which in the latter Adunaic language was called Anadune, which means westerness, and it was also referred to as Andor, which means the land of gift. So he's referring to the west as being Númenor. The Ril, now this refers to brilliance rather than flame. But it should be noted that the sun sets in the west, and the sun is a great, brilliant flame, and the sunset, makes everything sort of red like fire. So while a lesser poet might want to call the sword, flame of the west, and sort of clumsily transliterate to that something clunky like Númenthil, or even something more dreadful like Anornar, Aragorn found a pleasing word, Anduril. It just rolls right off the tongue, and that gives meaning to his sword. Aragorn the Second Elisar does things differently than Elendil did. He doesn't set himself up as the High King and have lesser kings beneath him. He doesn't seem to wish to differentiate between Arnor and Gondor. Instead, he just has the reunited kingdom, just as his sword is not two pieces, it's one whole. Lastly, I should mention the runes placed upon the sword during its reforging, 7 stars between the sun and the moon. Now, the 7 stars represents the Valakirka. I mentioned this earlier. It's a constellation that's important to every race and culture in Arda, and especially Númenor, like the standard that I mentioned earlier that Arwen made for Aragorn had, and that struck fear into the hearts of Sauron's minions, had these 7 stars on them. The sun and the moon are an important link to the past. Narsil was red and white flame, the sun and the moon, as well as the reunification of Arnor, Anor, which is the sun, Anarion, and Gondor, Ithil, the moon, Isildur. It's a unification of the bloodlines through Arvedui and Firiel, because, you might wonder, how is Aragorn descended from 2 brothers? Because they had descendants that, way down the line married each other. And that's why he's not only Isildur's heir, he's Anarion's heir as well, so he could be the king of both nations and say, hey, now they're one nation, just like this is one sword. All right, let's move on to the next question. All right, our next question was submitted by Mickey, and this is a bit of a briefer one. If Fëanor had been allowed to return to Middle-earth in the Second and Third Ages, would he have been interested by the Rings of Power? The answer to this is a good reason why he was not allowed to do such a thing. He wasn't even allowed to have a body and walk around in Eldamar, much less being allowed to go anywhere near Middle-earth. I generally I don't have a great view on what-if questions, but I think in here is an important lesson as to why Fëanor had to stay in Mandos until the end of the world. Fëanor did something very foolish and quite evil. He took an oath before God, with the Ainur as his witness, to retrieve the Silmarils at any and all cost, and vowing to kill anyone who got in his way even a little bit, regardless of who they were. He did something then that was even more evil. He had others take the oath with him. And as if that was not bad enough, when he was mortally wounded and close to bodily death, knowing that he would be set in Mandos for a long time, if not forever, he had his sons reiterate the oath. He had no regrets. It is not as if the sons of Fëanor could have just renounced the oath at this point. Ilúvatar isn't big on letting anyone take his name in vain. Just ask the dead men of Dunharrow. But doubling down on it shows you what an absolute fool he had become. Fëanor, he hated Morgoth, but he had become like Morgoth in some ways. And a big one was that he saw anyone who was not under his thumb as an enemy, even the Valar. He burned the ships to try to prevent the likes of his half-brother Fingolfin and his niece Galadriel from joining him, because they weren't his followers, and therefore they were useless to him at best, enemies at the worst. In a planned revision to the story that Tolkien was only starting to work on when he died, he even had already at this point murdered one of his sons, his youngest, who upon arriving in Middle-earth said that he wanted to sleep in comfort on the ships rather than sleep on the hard ground. Fëanor got it in his head that his son was going to take the ship back to Middle-earth and recant his oath, which he couldn't have done anyway. He could have back to Middle-earth, back to the Undying Lands, and recanted his oath. When he was asked if he knew that his son was on one of those ships that he burned, he said simply that he burned that one first. So what would he make of the Rings of Power? He would see the likes of Galadriel and Gandalf as very foolish, in his mind at least, because they did not take up the means to control others when they were offered it. Fëanor would seize the One Ring, and he would take care of some unfinished business that he had with Morgoth's greatest servant. He would dispose of Sauron and set himself on the throne of Barad-dûr. He would become the Lord of the Rings, and woe to any who had a Ring of Power on, because they would become the new Fëanorians, tasked with putting all of their efforts into finding and retrieving the lost Silmarils, perhaps even finding a way to assault Elendil in the sky. You kind of get why they chose Glorfindel instead. And I just wanted to briefly highlight one of the comments that Greg Moore wrote that said that this gives us further evidence as to why Galadriel was ultimately permitted to return to the uttermost west. She chose humility. Not only did she reject the One Ring, she helped in its destruction, knowing her own power would be lessened. She learned the lesson that Fëanor never did, and that's very true and very correct. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Jason Moore, who asks, what exactly would the One Ring have done for Sauron had he recovered it in the Third Age, and what would have manifested had he done so? So Sauron, he was going to win the war, regardless of regaining the One Ring or not, but the ring falling into the hands of his enemies represented a unique opportunity to stop him for good. The One Ring contained the greater part of Sauron's power, and it should be noted that losing it doesn't necessarily make him weaker. He's still in rapport with the power of the ring, which Tolkien details in and I mentioned this earlier, the ever-illuminating Letter 131, which I believe was to Peter Hastings. I'm going to read you a brief part of that. But even if he did not wear it, that power existed and was within rapport with himself. He was not diminished, unless some other seized it and became possessed of it. If that happened, the new possessor could, if sufficiently strong and heroic by nature, challenge Sauron, become master of all that he had learned or done since the making of the One Ring, and so overthrow him and usurp his place. So, as we see here in the author's own words, Sauron does not need to wear the ring. He poured his power into it, but this doesn't separate his power spiritually, only physically. Thus you may ask two questions. The first being, why was he so weak after losing the One Ring? And the second being, how could he think the One Ring was destroyed by his enemies, as Gandalf stated, when he was in rapport with its power? The answer to both of these questions is tied up in the fact that regardless of having, wearing and using the One Ring, he was still defeated. His armies were defeated after a long war, and his tower was put under siege for several years before he was bested in battle by Gil-galad and Elendil. Regardless of the fact that these two mighty high kings were also slain in battle, Sauron was defeated. The ring was taken, his body withered and lost. Even if Sauron could return swiftly, his army was still devastated and his lands occupied. The elves and men lost their kings, but they were still triumphant. If we study the history of Tolkien's world, we can see a constant theme. Evil is diminished in power over time. We see also diminishment of the heroes in the Third Age. The elves are slowly leaving Middle-earth, and the line of kings falls. But when I say evil is diminished, I'm not talking about populations, but individuals. Melkor, Morgoth. He starts out as the mightiest being in the whole world, the second mightiest being in the universe behind only God himself, but he loses his first war against the combined might of all 14 Valar, and then the second time he fights, it's only against 2 of the Valar, and the third time, it's an elf. Now, he wins that one, but he gets wounded really badly, and the last fight was against a single Maya who defeated him soundly. Fëanor was made to be the greatest of all the children of Ilúvatar, not only in might, but in beauty, skill, understanding, and subtlety. But his marring, by the words of Melkor, made him absolutely lose a bit of the understanding and the subtlety. I would say more than a bit, I would say a lot. And this led to himself and many other elves going to ruin. Saruman starts as the White, not only the head of the Astari, that's the wizards, but the head of the White Council. Essentially, he's the big good guy of Middle-earth, but in the end, he's a petty gangster taking over the Shire and being ousted and then murdered by his lowly servant. Sauron starts off as the greatest craftsman of the Maiar and the most skilled in magic, and he ends up essentially a sad cloud. On the converse, a character like Gandalf becomes mightier despite his own death. He's rewarded for his valor, and he's returned to life greater than ever. Each defeat made Sauron weaker. After being bested by Lúthien and Huan, he sat out the War of Wrath. After his armies were crushed by Pharazôn, he surrendered and took a non-violent approach to destroying Númenor, which worked. But this led to his greatest physical defeat, when God himself smote the entire nation, Sauron included. Sauron never really recovered from this downfall called the Akalabeth, and while he was able to get his spirit and his ring back to Middle-earth, he didn't really have the time needed to recover from this devastating blow, which even robbed him of his ability to make himself appear beautiful, and thus he was able to be defeated in direct combat with a man and an elf. The loss of the One Ring wasn't what made him weaker, but rather being kicked around by the Akalabeth and then having another body trashed by Elendil and Gil-galad was what made him weaker. Still the most dangerous being in Middle-earth, but quite diminished. Sauron never considered another person holding the One Ring, and he theorized that as it fell into the hands of his enemies, they must have destroyed it. It is also quite possible that he never realized what the ring's destruction would actually mean for him. Perhaps he thought that the power encased in the ring would return to him, just as some of the elves thought that if the One Ring was destroyed, that the three would retain their power instead of losing their power. And that they were wrong, and Sauron was wrong. He was disabused of the notion of his enemies having destroyed the One Ring when he met Gollum, who not only proved that it was still out there, but it was in the hands of a hobbit named Baggins. So Sauron was in a position to win the War of the Ring. Gondor was the last bastion of resistance in the south and was without a king. It was driven back from Osgiliath to Minas Tirith, had a history of depopulation, plague, kin strife, just overall weakened. The north, the dwarves were building their power, as were the men, but he still likely would have overcome them. The war in the north ended when the ring was destroyed, and the Easterlings just wound up going home. A victory for men and dwarves, but at the cost of King Brand and Dane the Second, Ironfoot King under the mountain. If he would have, pushed further west, the likes of Thranduil and Elrond would not be able to hold him back forever. Sauron regaining the ring means there's no path to victory. Even the final battle at Morannon was only to distract Sauron from what was going on in his own realm, Frodo and Sam inching towards Mount Doom. If he regains the ring, he will make sure that no one ever wrests it from him again, probably just by not ever, meeting people again. He would just stay out of combat and let his armies slowly but surely overtake Middle-earth. The ring falling back into his hands doesn't necessarily make him, mightier, but it makes the heroes weaker. Gandalf, Galadriel, and Elrond all hold rings of power. They only feel safe holding these rings and using these rings in the absence of the Lord of the Rings. If Sauron was to regain that title, or if another took up the one and became the Lord of the Rings, setting himself in Sauron's place, such as Saruman or even Galadriel or Gandalf, because they were offered the ring. Of course, they turned it down. The three are not safe. Whoever claims the ring as his or her own would set themselves on the throne of Barad-dûr and become the enemy of the free peoples of Middle-earth. All right, let's move on to the next question. Here's one from Oski Bosky. This one's a bit quicker. Would the Balrog have woken up if Pippin didn't make that noise in Moria? So the mistake made here is thinking that the Balrog was sleeping at this time. If the Balrog was still awake, then it wouldn't be Moria, the Black Pit. It would, a dangerous and evil place. It would be Khazad-dûm, the city of the dwarves. The Fellowship wouldn't even be there, because the events of the Hobbit wouldn't have happened. The dwarves founded Erebor, the Lonely Mountain, as refugees of Moria after fleeing from the Balrog. The Balrog burrowed deep below Khazad-dûm at the end of the First Age, and it was itself a refugee of the War of Wrath. It slumbered under the city for thousands of years until it awoke in the Third Age, when the city's downward expansion finally breached the tunnels where it was. The Balrog was the end of the civilization, with the dwarves scattering outwards. It was very much awake at this point. Pippin tossing a stone into the well, it had nothing to do with the Balrog, or even any of the orcs. They were still, at this point, in the western part of Moria. The Balrog and the orcs are in the eastern side. Now, the party do hear sounds afterwards that may be hammers used for communication, but the fact is that no one living in Moria had any reason to believe that the sound of a stone falling down a well was an indication of anything. It could have been an orc knocking the stone in, or it could have been just the crumbling buildings, the infrastructure falling apart. These sort of noises probably happened all the time in Moria, and it's not like the company were being very quiet. The reason that Pippin got yelled at for doing this was not because, that he might have given away their position, but because Gandalf was trying to concentrate, and this was annoying to him. Keep in mind that after this, they reach a grand hall, and Gimli sings a song, and the text goes on about how the sound of his voice echoes throughout the chambers. The stone was, not much compared to that in terms of noise, and there's no mistaking the sound of a singing dwarf for crumbling buildings. So, if anybody gave it away, it would have been Gimli, but even then still, they were, still kind of on the, the western side. So, I would say that, what really got the Balrog riled up is that 30 years ago, which to a Balrog is not very long at all, Balin had come there, and he was in the Balrog's territory and had made a colony. So now, all of a sudden this guy's on like high alert for intruders. So when the Fellowship get close to him, it's like, oh, more of these guys. All right, we have one more question to get to. Our final question comes in from Link of Wise, who asks, why did Sauron, who cannot age, choose to fight Elendil and Gil-galad instead of just staying in the tower the way Saruman did, waiting for them to lower their guard? Well, they weren't going to lower their guard. I suppose the suggestion that he cannot age refers to the fact that maybe he could just wait out Elendil's life, and that's not relevant at all. So let's say Sauron decides to just sit in his tower and wait until Elendil dies, which is possible, but Gil-galad won't die. None of the elves will die. Sauron's army had been defeated, and his tower was under siege for 7 years, and during this, the most he could do was kill an Aryan by tossing an object from the tower. And we don't even know if Sauron himself did that or if one of his minions did it. Sauron does not want to be stuck in the tower, unable to actually do anything, surrounded by this large army for decades. They're in a siege. They're not going to let their guard down. He can't rebuild his army. He can't expand his territory. He can't dominate others. He's just stuck waiting. Sure, he could wait decades and fight Gil-galad, but, even without Elendil, it's not as if the High King would be alone. Because then, well, there's Isildur, and, Glorfindel might have joined the fray at this point, and that would have made things worse for Sauron, I think. Not to mention that if the siege went on much longer, it's very possible that they might have just torn the whole tower down. They tore the tower down afterwards. They left the foundation, unfortunately, but, they could have brought in implements to damage the tower just to pull the whole thing down with Sauron in it, which would have been very bad for him. So he had to break the siege before things got worse for him. So anyway, I had a blast answering your questions this week, and please send me more questions, leave me some comments, like the video, and if you got to this point and you're not subscribed already, well, just tickle the subscribe button. Make sure that you have notifications turned on, and by the way, if you're watching this video and you're like, I already subscribed to you, double check. Sometimes people get randomly unsubscribed. If you want to support me in a bigger way, consider joining the channel as a member. Members pay $5 a month, and you do get perks. You get a cool little Gandalf rune on your name, on your icon, and that happens when you leave a comment or when you chat and live stream. And I am going to be live streaming more often here on YouTube as well as on Twitch, of course. And you get some emotes that you can use, like I said, in live streams and, of course, in comments. But the most important thing is you get to see all the videos early. Every Q&A video at least a week early, and some other videos you get to see even up to 2 weeks early. So it's a big deal. You get to see everything early. When you leave a comment on those members-only videos, there's nobody else there but members, so I'm laser focused on that. Like I said, you don't have to do it. It's not that big of a deal, but it really does help me out if you join the channel as a member, so just consider it. Anyway, I will see you guys next time.